Hello, everybody, dear guests, dear partners, dear students. We continue our conference, which is entitled the NPT at 50 Challenges, Opportunity and Russian National Interests. And today we have many sessions. The first session is the regional proliferation challenges. And then we have at 3 p.m. Moscow time, we have 3 sessions in parallel. And I would strongly recommend people who are not participating as a speakers in these sessions, but would like to participate as a in discussion. Please write your desire to participate in concrete sessions, because we need to to help you to be in this hall where this session is. And the last session will be informal. It will be a book presentation, which is published by our colleagues and our also Urals group. So it will be round table at 5:15 p.m. Moscow time. So we are waiting for you. And now I would like to give the floor to our moderators of the first panel, to Arina Kazantseva and Kamran Guseinov. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Ekaterina. Good afternoon and morning, dear participants and dear guests. My name is Kamran Guseinov. I am the assistant at the Department of Theory and History of International Relations here at Ural Federal University. On behalf of the organizing committee, let me express my deepest gratitude to all the participants of our conference. Today, I'm moderating the session, The Regional Proliferation Challenges, together with my colleague, Arina Kazantseva. I do believe that regional issues are quite important and topical for the studying of nuclear non-proliferation. So I hope we are going to have a very fruitful cooperation during our session. And now let me introduce our speakers. Adlan Margoyev, analyst at the Institute for International Studies of MGIMO University, Moscow, Russia. Gleb Toropchin, Associate Professor of Novosibirsk State Technical University and Novosibirsk State University of Economics and Management. Leonid Tsukanov, Head of the Middle East Youth Association from Yekaterinburg, Russia, who is going to present a joint work with Professor Gulnara Valyahmetova from Ural Federal University and Oksana Likarenko, Professor from Tomsk State University. Now I give the floor to my colleague Arina for the clarifying of the following procedure.
Thank you, Kamran. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. My name is Arina Kazantseva, and today we continue to discuss nuclear regime issues. And before we begin, I would like you to remind you some rules of procedure. First of all, I would like to mention that our session will be broadcasting live at the official URFU account at the YouTube. And speakers will have approximately 20 minutes to perform their speeches. Q&A session will be at the end of the meeting. And to ask your question to our speakers, please use the chat form. To address your question, follow this form, a question to and the name of the speaker. Please remember to keep your microphone and camera turned off. And dear speakers, thank you for your participation. And for all our guests, I hope you enjoy our following discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Arina. And our first speaker is Adlan Margoyev with the report, Iran's nuclear program scenario analysis. Adlan, please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I will share my slides in a second, and I hope that the connection will be good enough for you to hear me smoothly. Thank you. Thank the Ural Federal University and Professor Mikhailenko and her team for organizing such a wonderful conference and hosting me as a speaker. I will try to be brief in sharing a brief analysis of Iran's nuclear program and some of the scenarios that we could see in the coming years, and leave more time for a Q&A session. So what is the methodology? There is no math involved in it, but we have to follow 2 steps. First, identify variables and factors that will influence the outcome of any situation in the coming future. Those variables could be events. Let's say if somebody wins, then the foreign policy of that country will drastically change. Or those could be conditions. Let's say if unemployment rate stays high or turns higher than it is now, then there will be a social unrest in country A, and etc. And then you, out of the pool of variables and factors that you identify, you select two major independent variables and then plot them on a coordinate plane. Once you have these two variables on the coordinate plane, you have 4 quadrants, and each of them stands for an individual scenario. Sometimes identifying 4 scenarios is too simplistic and does not give you a nuanced approach to scenario building. And then you can add to any of the unclarified scenarios 2 more variables out of your pool that will solidify this approach and make it more nuanced. And you can go further and further and further. In my analysis, I try to identify 2 variables that will have a major impact on Iran's nuclear program, as well as its broader relationship with the United States. One of the 2 variables is return to the JCPOA or a failure to return to the JCPOA. And the other one is Iran's priority, either national development, sustainability of its regime and economy versus regional development, regional influence, and operations beyond Iran's borders to the detriment of Iran's adversaries' security. What kind of scenarios we can have when we overlap these 2 variables over each other? If the 2 sides, mainly Iran and the United States, who either partly follow the JCPOA or pulled out of the JCPOA a few years ago, return to the deal in full, and Iran prioritizes its national development over regional influence, then we will observe fragile stability. It is the stability which brings us some predictability about what Iran is going to do in the region, and specifically with Iran's nuclear program, because it would then have to follow in full all the provisions of the JCPOA. But it will be fragile because Iran will not abandon its revolutionary ideology and will spread its influence in the region, support the oppressed nations and groups, and continue its active regional policy, which is an irritant for the United States and its allies. And then, certain disagreement will stay in place and would have to open up for negotiations. If the 2 parties stay in the JCPOA and Iran becomes active in the region once more, then there might be new opportunities for reaching a deal that would cover not only the Iranian nuclear program, but as well as its regional policies and maybe ballistic missile program. But I would not go that far in my analysis because Iran is resentful in terms of discussing its ballistic missile program. What if the Biden administration does not manage to convince Iran to return to the JCPOA in full and fails to do it itself? Iran may have to still prioritize its national development because of the sorry state of its economy, but without a deal, the respite will not last long because Iran will stay active in the region, and the provocations that we could observe since the Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA, like attacks on Saudi oil facilities, like frequent attacks against American infrastructure and facilities of interest of the United States in Iraq and beyond, may trigger a full-out war, which is something that many countries, including the United States and Iran, are currently trying to avoid. What are the challenges to return to the JCPOA as the preferential scenario for all of the parties involved? Currently, there are two sets of challenges. One is technical and the other one is political. As for the technical challenges, we have to update the status of Iran's nuclear program. We see LEU reserves are higher than under the JCPOA, and that is a solvable problem because Russia, as it did in 2015 after the conclusion of the JCPOA, may help Iran withdrawing excess LEU stockpiles from Iran, and Kazakhstan actually could play a role in this if certain agreements were reached. And bringing that cap back to the 300 kilograms is not an unsolvable problem. As for the enrichment level, we can see that Iran did not return to the 19% enrichment cap, and it's not going far more, and does not exceed the 4.5 or sometimes 5% enrichment level. And getting back to the 3.67 is not an unsolvable technical problem. An IAEA additional protocol is provisionally in force. They never ratified it, and we hope, and in Russia and in other countries, that they may sometime, in some time, do it under the JCPOA. But at least technically speaking, it is provisionally in force, and there are a few problems with that. All of them are being resolved with the IAEA. What remains a difficulty in terms of technical aspects of the JCPOA is the centrifuges. They did not reinstall all of the 19,000 centrifuges that were before the JCPOA, but the additional around 1,000 centrifuges that are operating now are not the old type IR1 centrifuges, but the newer ones. And Iran, over the past few years after the US withdrawal from the JCPOA, managed to produce even newer centrifuges that are not even mentioned in the JCPOA. And of course, removing the knowledge from the Iranian scientific community about those centrifuges is impossible. And getting back to the JCPOA in terms of the research and development that has been done in Iran over the past few years is a difficulty, but that difficulty will be used as a trade-off by the US on other issues, because on the US side, returning to the JCPOA has its own difficulties, but mainly the political ones. As for the political issues and challenges, there are two major issues with either of the two sides. As for the Iranians, Iran claims it has never left the table, and US should return first. And the sequencing of actions is important. Iran can do some JPA, the Joint Plan of Action, which was a preliminary agreement before the JCPOA was reached. This JPA type of agreement could be reached once again, as that would outline the sequence of actions like removing the sanctions that Trump reimposed, and Iran scaling back its nuclear program and getting it back to under the JCPOA caps. And that sequence of actions would have to be negotiated once again. As for the Americans, the Biden administration is not almighty. It has to coordinate its actions with the Republican Senate under the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act. And the certification of Iran's compliance with the JCPOA does matter in that regard, because if Iran does not get back in full, then the certification of Iran's compliance with the JCPOA in the US Congress gets complicated. So how to make this sequence of actions work smoothly is something that has to be negotiated. The second issue is that the Americans want to strengthen and lengthen the provisions of the JCPOA and ideally get a new deal. In that regard, the Democrats are not standing far from Republicans in terms of their demands for Iran, but they want to shape those demands in terms of a more for more approach. But for the Iranians, they cannot speak about any strengthening or lengthening of the JCPOA provisions because they never benefited from the JCPOA itself. So getting back to the pre-Trump status quo would require additional political capital on the side of the Iranian political leadership. And for that, in that regard, they request and require some kind of a compensation from the Americans to return back to the JCPOA, because they estimate the losses that Iran suffered from over the past few years from the reimposed sanctions by the US as amounting to $200 billion. Of course, Iran is not expecting any paycheck and a bill on the US side, and the Americans would never compensate for anything. They would just say that it was a different administration when we have nothing to do with them. But again, we have to think creatively about what kind of compensation would be sufficient enough for the Iranians to get back to the JCPOA in full. What are the Russian interests in this situation? First, of course, we want to see the full return to the JCPOA because Moscow never left the agreement and invested a lot of effort into the implementation and negotiation of the deal. Why we need this? We need this to strengthen the NPT because there are very few cases where we can observe any progress in terms of regional challenges to non-proliferation, and Iran is definitely one of them. We just have to get back to 2017 or a similar status quo to report to the 2021 NPT REFCON and say, we have done at least something positive in that way, in regard. Of course, Russia wants to save its nuclear cooperation with Iran, and currently Moscow is building the second unit of the nuclear power plant in Bushehr, and that has to be continued. Currently, there is a risk of sanctions to Rosatom for its activities with Iran because of the reimposition of US sanctions against Iran by the Trump administration. So that has to be resolved as well. Again, the sequencing matters. Rosatom may find it difficult to help Iran to get back to the JCPOA technically before the sanctions are removed. So it's not even the US-Iran sequencing of actions, but US-Iran and other countries like Russia, maybe China and Kazakhstan also involved in these in this preliminary plan of getting back to the JCPOA. And of course, Iran matters for Russia mainly because of the regional security considerations. Russia doesn't want a war just across its southern borders. And over the past 5 or several more years, Tehran became part of top 3 nations in which Russia has maintained contacts on the ministerial level. So Kommersant newspaper and my colleagues at the Institute jointly conducted a research and which identified that Lavrov over the past 10 years met Iranian foreign minister just a lot more than other nations, and only Germany and the United States exceeded the amount of times in terms of the telephone and contacts and meetings. And that is mostly due to the Astana process and the nuclear talks on the Iranian nuclear program. So the strengthening of the regional dialogue with active participation of Russia and Iran is important. And the getting back to the JCPOA is just one step in that regard. And I think I will stop here to leave more time for questions and answers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Adlan, for your very thoughtful presentation. And our next speaker is Gleb Toropchin, Asia Pacific region, driver of nuclear energy growth. Please, Gleb, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Kamran. I want to extend my deepest gratitude to colleagues from Ural State, Ural Federal University. It is a pleasure to be here. Of course, I would like to visit Yekaterinburg for the 4th time in my life, but unfortunately the pandemic got a little bit in these plans. But anyway, I would like to present my research. Hopefully you can see the slides. I would like to present my research devoted to the analysis of the Asia-Pacific region as a driver of nuclear energy growth. And it's not in vain that I have this question mark here. Basically, this study is based on my monograph to be published next year, hopefully. And I would like to also thank senior colleagues, Dr. Pobedash and Professor Diruglazova, for providing their insightful comments for my book to be published. And hopefully it will be printed next year. Okay, so without further ado, I think we can begin. So I think we'll skip the outline. So why nuclear power and why Asia Pacific at first? So let's talk about geography at first. Of course, as you might know, there are different definitions of Asia Pacific / Indo-Pacific, and there are lots of them. And if you like to know my opinion about this, you can always read my paper on Asia Pacific and Indo-Pacific. It was recently published on in one of the journals of the Russian Academy of Science, namely the Problems of the Far East, in Russian, of course. If you're interested, I can always give you the link. So we regard the Asia Pacific as a macro region here, which is divided in turn into several subregions, I would say. Anyway, we regard them in a very broad context. Of course, I will explain what subregions mean a little bit later. Next, the topic of our conference has to do with NPT. And yesterday we talked a lot about Article 1, Article 2, and of course, Article 6. Nevertheless, Article 4 is often forgotten. And I would say this is a little bit tricky when it comes to peaceful use of nuclear power, because this is not only an inalienable right of the NPT parties, countries which are parties to the NPT, but also it is maybe sort of a privilege, and NPT has always regarded this as a right to do so. And as we see, nuclear fuel cycle is also a complex technological concept. Technically, it was developed at first from a military nuclear fuel cycle, and civilian nuclear fuel cycle is closely intertwined with the military NFC. And as we will see, such actions as uranium mining and spent nuclear fuel disposal are very important for both military and civilian concepts here. Why Asia Pacific, you might ask? Asia Pacific has been growing by leaps and bounds, as they say. So this rapid economic growth presupposes the need for new energy sources. And as you could see from the title of my presentation, Asia is often seen as a driver of nuclear energy. And the deceased Yukiya Amano, who used to be the Director General of the IAEA, said that Asia is a driver of nuclear energy. Nevertheless, I would like to see where it is true or where it is not true, maybe. If you ask me about figures, around 130 nuclear reactors are currently operating in Asia, and this is more than it was in the beginning of the century. Now, nuclear accounts only for 2% of the energy in Asia, as you can see from the slide, whereas globally it's around 10%. So there's this discrepancy, and I will talk about it a little bit later. So there is room for improvement, and there is a lot to do. There's much work ahead in this regard. So in late 2000s, we talked about nuclear renaissance. We talked about it because more and more reactors were built, and this is why it was really important back then. But of course, in 2011, Fukushima Daiichi accident happened in Japan, and it turned out to be a game-changing factor in the first place for Asia, but also for the rest of the world, I would argue. At any rate, allow me to continue with some graphs and maps. So as you can see, Asia Pacific technically comprises half of the world in this broad understanding. And as you can see from these figures on the slide, Japan used to be the leader of nuclear power growth before 2011. 11. However, now it is not the case, and there are new leaders such as China, South Korea, even though there are some peculiarities to this issue. So I would like to divide this region for the purpose of this research into several sub-regions. First and foremost, it's East Asia. As we will see later, it is quite important for this regions, macro region, I mean. Some Russian scholars argue that East Asia is self-sufficient in terms of power supply. Nevertheless, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that China, for example, with its huge industrial growth, recently has been importing more and more hydrocarbons, and using them for its industry, of course. And this is also the case for the nuclear power development in China. It has been opening more and more reactors. If you take a look at its 13th five-year economic development plan, as in Russian we call it Пятилетка, you would see that they had some really optimistic plans to introduce 58 gigawatts of energy to their energy mix. I mean, nuclear energy, of course. Nevertheless, it turned out to be not true so far, and they introduced, of course, new blocks, new reactors. Nevertheless, so far it is not enough. If you ask me about figures again, it's around 5%. So nuclear accounts for 5% in the energy mix of China. Now, Japan and South Korea, as well as Taiwan, I would say, have some really well-developed infrastructure. They had, at least used to have, a lot of reactors. Nevertheless, as you know, after they phased out in 2011, after the Fukushima Daiichi accident in Japan, the percentage of nuclear in the energy mix gradually decreases. It is also the case for South Korea, even though they are rebuilding some of their nuclear power reactors. It is still a problem for them, even though there is Shinkori, which is in Korean new Kori. It is a new generation reactor. It's still problematic to see if South Korea can retain its nuclear power in its energy mix. So as I said, PRC is seen as the main driver of nuclear power growth here in this region, whereas other countries and territories such as Taiwan are planning to phase out their nuclear power plants. Some of them are labeled as threshold states, and this is when this problem of intertwining between the military and the peaceful use of nuclear energy comes at the fore. So they have such developed infrastructure, and the elites in South Korea and in Japan sometimes consider this opportunity to go nuclear not only in peaceful terms. Of course, presence of North Korea is still there, and it is a game-changing factor as well. But North Korea, I would like to mention, does not use nuclear power for civilian purposes. The biggest nuclear power plant used to be here. I mean, the world's biggest nuclear power plant, Kashiwazaki Kariwa in Japan. Now it's being phased out. It accounted for as much as 8 gigawatts of energy, and that's a lot. Now, one of the Chinese nuclear power plants has this status of one of the biggest power plants, Yangjiang. And as I said, public opinion also matters a lot. About Southeast Asia, this sub-region has been regarded as one of the most promising in terms of possible introduction of the nuclear energy. As you see from the figures on the slide, energy demand is really high here. And besides, there was this nuclear weapons-free zone concluded in 1995 with the Bangkok Treaty, and the TPNW is also quite a pressing issue here, because all of the 10 countries, except for one, actually signed this treaty. Some of them have already ratified it. Nevertheless, Singapore abstained, and the public attitude towards nuclear power remains somewhat ambivalent in this sub-region. There's not a single NPP so far here. There used to be one. It didn't ever hasn't ever worked, Bataan in the Philippines. It's not functioning now, it's rather a tourist attraction site. Why would these countries go nuclear? Possibly. Of course, they depend a lot on external suppliers of nuclear technologies. This is why potentially some of the players, such as Rosatom, or maybe the French Orano, or maybe Westinghouse, after it went bankrupt and got reorganized, or even the Chinese CNNC could play this role for supporting these countries in terms of the development of civilian nuclear energy. At times, these countries do have testimonies of readiness for developing nuclear power. Nevertheless, preliminary studies made by the IAEA and by the local communities, local governments, show that it's still a problem, and the problem is they have the example of Fukushima in front of their eyes, and some of these countries, as you see, are situated on islands. This is why it might be a problem. If there's a tsunami, then what are the odds that these countries are safe if they have nuclear power plants? South Asia. So this picture was taken, this map was taken from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists website. It shows actually the sites of radiological instability, as it was said, because radiology is something that also matters. As you see, civilian application of nuclear energy is not limited to nuclear power plants. It's also nuclear medicine, treating cancer. It's also industrial isotopes and so on. So this is a very complex issue, like I said. So the impact of the nuclear standoff, this impasse between New Delhi and Islamabad, is still there. And both countries are, as you know, nuclear weapon states, but not within the NPT, but outside the NPT. So this is still a problem. Guarantees and the 123 agreement between the United States and India is still rather debatable. And with Pakistan, the problem is it has very close connections with China in its civilian nuclear program, and some scholars have asked whether this is a problem for the possible development of the Pakistan's military program. So as you see, civilian nuclear programs are indeed a byproduct of their military developments, and in 1998 both countries tested their nuclear weapons. With India it was the case even before that, in 1974. Why would these countries need nuclear power? The answer is quite obvious in my opinion. So there's this growing energy demand in terms of demographic pressure, and of course this situation of competition between the two countries. As you can see, significant influence of external actors really takes place. A lot of foreign companies are interested in developing the local markets and building more reactors than there are now. For example, for India, this external actor is the Canadian Candu. For Pakistan, it's CNNC. With Rosatom, it's also a very good example, because in Bangladesh, the Rupur nuclear power plant is currently being built by Rosatom. And with India, there's also an example of cooperation with Kudankulam, one of the nuclear power plants. One of the problems, of course, the nuclear fuel, because Indian uranium is not of very high quality. There are some talks about the thorium cycle, the Bhabha problem, if you have heard of this famous scientist who is kind of responsible for building this plan for development of nuclear energy in India. It presupposes 3 stages, and thorium cycle is seen as one of the opportunities, but still it's not a reality. It's rather a projection, and it's a matter of future work. Australia and the Pacific, another nuclear weapons-free zone, according to the Rarotonga Treaty. So as you see, it covers just 2 middle powers, even if New Zealand can be considered as a middle power. And the problem is, of course, in Papua New Guinea and the small island states, it's quite difficult to imagine, to envision the creation of these nuclear reactors. And in Papua New Guinea, there are some facilities for nuclear medicine, but it's rather a radiological facility than a nuclear one. In these countries, the anti-nuclear legislation is quite strong, and at least at the level of states in Australia. And talking about the anti-nuclear sentiment, why was it even caused? The background is, of course, nuclear tests conducted by nuclear weapon states, a lot of them, France and Polynesia. It was, of course, Great Britain in Australia, in Maralinga, and this is a trauma for Australia right now, and it is highly unlikely, to my mind, that Australia goes nuclear in the short run or in the long run. As you can see, public opinion really opposes nuclear energy, even though Australia has some considerable uranium deposits. It's one of the top three uranium suppliers of the world globally, along with Kazakhstan and Canada. So the opportunities are still there for them, at least on the paper. So pros and cons. Finally, I have 5 minutes left, and we can talk a little bit about why would Asia-Pacific countries go nuclear and why not? So obviously, this is low carbon power source, and with the Millennium Goals and with the Paris Agreement, of course, it's an issue for the countries, how and why to go nuclear. As you can see, it's a possibility, and the renewables which are often seen as an alternative, are not always the solution, because for some countries it's quite expensive to install them. For some countries it's not possible. For example, wind installations require a lot of space, and with solar panels, for instance, in South Korea, there are not so many sunny days, so it might be a problem for this. It's a long-term investment, on the other hand, and this technology is top-notch technology, of course, and a lot of exporters throughout the globe are ready to invest in these countries, especially Southeast Asia, but as you can see, there are some problems. I will talk about them a little bit later. Currently, the uranium prices on the global market are quite low, and compared with the situation in 2007, for example, the situation is different because there was this boom, and now it's not the case. And Asia-Pacific accounts for 57% of global uranium deposits. So this is why they could use their own uranium for fueling their reactors. Besides, nuclear power is pretty cheap in terms of generation. Of course, it depends on the country. In some of the countries, renewables are cheaper. In some of the countries, nuclear is cheaper. Of course, the problem is to build these reactors, which is not a cheap undertaking in itself. And finally, last but not least, dependency on fossil fuel imports. As I showed previously in one of the previous slides, for example, Japan and Korea do not enjoy their deposits of natural resources at all. So, nuclear power in the Asia-Pacific cons for now. Of course, seismic activity and tsunamis. There's even a term in Japanese, which was coined after this Fukushima Daiichi accident, for the possible accidents related to tsunamis and earthquakes. Of course, it is the case, because this is a maritime region after all. Then, nuclear power industry is interconnected with high costs and high risks, of course, which is in turn related to the negative attitude of the public opinion to this issue. Besides, these countries lack experience of highly qualified specialists. Of course, some specialists do study at MEFI in Moscow, for example, but this is not always the solution, because they come back to Vietnam, for instance, and they virtually have no jobs, and this is a problem as well. Besides, the problem of non-proliferation and disarmament is, of course, still there. The presence of nuclear weapon states, as well as unofficial, as we say, nuclear weapon states such as North Korea, India, Pakistan. And besides, it's intertwined with nuclear safety and security concerns, building their regime, and this might be a problem. Right now, the fossil fuels are, as you, of course, are aware, relatively low, as we can see from the oil prices, not only oil prices, but also gas prices. I talked about the perception of nuclear power by the general public, but elites do not also always wish to invest in this undertaking. And finally, the legal framework is suffering from gaps. As for findings, I will not spend a lot of time here. So as we could see, there is this interregional imbalance between the regions. So take East Asia, it is the leader, it is developing quite rapidly, even though Japan and South Korea are phasing out, China is compensating for this. So as you can see on the example of the Pacific part of the Asia Pacific, it's not the case for them. So there's this gap between leaders plus threshold states to some extent and the rest, which is kind of followed from the first point. As you can see, the region experiences a need for a more unified regional framework in terms of cooperation and so on. So this is also a problem, and the role of external actors and Rosatom might have an opportunity in this regard, even though some of the undertakings are maybe not so successful as in Vietnam, but I could talk about it in the Q&A session. And finally, importance of the track 2 and 3 diplomacy, as well as educating opinion, the public, the general public, that nuclear weapons is bad, whereas nuclear energy for peaceful purposes is not always bad. Okay, I'm resting my case. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gleb, for your informative presentation. Our next speaker is Leonid Tsukanov, Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone in the Middle East, Regional Powers Approach. Please, Leonid Tsukanov, it's over to you now.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'll talk about VMD-free zone on the Middle East today. And now I ask organizing committee to show my presentation, please. Thank you. My topic today is VMD-free zone in the Middle East, regional powers approach. So I want to start with the information that in the 21st century, the Middle East retains its traditionally high conflict potential. This is largely due to the growing pace of militarization and the export and import of weapons, as well as the general situation of the region with weapons, including VMD. This in turn determines the interest of the world community in reducing regional tensions. One of the methods to achieve this goal could be the creation of VMD-free zone in the Middle East. Next slide, please. Let's start with the fact that the first steps to create a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East were taken back in the 1960s with the development of a similar agreement on Latin America. But they didn't receive broad support with the expectation of the Iran-Egyptian declaration on the joint efforts. In the future, this problem has repeatedly become the subject of discussion at NPT review conferences, but Israel's categorical position didn't allow the parties to reach a compromise. A kind of breakthrough in the area was the adoption by the UN in 2014, of course, towards turning the Middle East into a VMD-free zone, as well as formal support from this initiative by all leading regional countries. In addition, on 2008, the UN General Assembly decided to convene at the end of 2019 a conference on the creation of VMD-free zone in the Middle East. This idea also was supported by regional organizations, including the League of Arab States and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. However, despite this, the leading Middle Eastern powers assess the prospects for the implementation of the initiative differently. The different assessment is largely due to the perception of the topic of a nuclear-free zone by these countries. Firstly, because all the powers participate in the development of peaceful nuclear programs and pay increased attention to any attempts to limit their field of maneuver. The second important factor is that presence of nuclear weapons in two states, Israel de facto and Turkey, NATO weapons. Next slide, please. So let's start from Israel. The concept of a VMD-free zone is in the Middle East has traditionally been criticized in Israel as a threat to national security. This approach is associated not only with the phenomenon of the nuclear umbrella, but also partly due to the doctrine of asymmetric warfare, adopted at the end of 2018. The concept of warfare in the context of proxy conflicts involving the use of tactical nuclear weapons. In addition, being a member of the IAEA and formally not possessing nuclear weapons, Israel nevertheless didn't join the NPT, which greatly complicates the UN's work with it in the area of nuclear non-proliferation. The official position of the Israeli government, as a rule, is based on the thesis of the existence of permanent latent threat, which makes further cooperation on nuclear disarmament issues impractical from a security point of view. It is important to note that the Israeli public fully shares the official state position. So, according to the Institute for National Security Studies, about 75% of Israeli citizens oppose the concept of VMD-free zone. Another 7% agree on the limit use of this project, but only if provided that Israel remains outside the area. Experts believe that this situation is due, among other things, to be modest results of the international conference, which was organized in 2013 in Haifa by anti-nuclear activists and did not receive further significant development. Next slide, please. Now we move to Islamic Republic of Iran. The nuclear issues has become particularly acute since the end of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Actions. Nevertheless, despite the growing international pressure, Iran still adheres to the concept of a peaceful atom and treats the idea of creating a nuclear-free zone mostly positively. Iranian politicians consider Israel's refusal to cooperate in nuclear security as a key obstacle to the implementation of this concept. So, at the 63rd General Conference of the IAEA, the permanent representative of Iran to international organizations called on the international community to put pressure on Israel to join the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation and resume work on the particle denuclearization of the Middle East. The religious factor, as we can see, had a decisive influence on the final interpretation of this idea. According to the position of modern Shiite theologians, the use of nuclear bombs, as well as an attempt to create it, is a great sin for a Muslim. This idea was finally consolidated by the spiritual leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, by issuing a fatwa in early 2019 condemning the use of nuclear energy for the purpose of causing harm. In this context, the concept of VMD-free zone is perceived by Iranian society as correct not only from a political but also from a religious point of view. On the other hand, the development of the Iranian military-industrial complex suggests the opposite. In 2020, Iran shown some missiles, for example, Ghadr and Shahid Haj Qasem, which were adapted for carrying a nuclear charge. With the US presidential administration doing its best to extend the heavy weapons embargo to Iran, which ends on October 19th under JCPOA and Resolution 2231, Iran's new missiles demonstrate Tehran's resolve as well as its growing capabilities under a policy of self-sufficiency. As a result, against the background of the events taking place in the region, the dialogue between Iran and the rest of the world on the creation of VMD-free zone may freeze. Next slide, please. Egypt is the main driving force behind the creation of VMD-free zone in the region. The ideological basis of this course was stated in the initiative of President Hosni Mubarak and later partly included in the long-term political strategy vision of Egypt 2030. Egyptian politicians emphasize that the presence of weapons of mass destruction in the region, coupled with the violent foreign policies of some actors, turn the Middle East into a powder magazine of the planet. Recently, that idea, which active participation of Egypt, has been broadcasted through the Secretariat of the League of Arab States. Nevertheless, the official position of the Egyptian government doesn't conclude with the moods in the Egyptian society. This was confirmed by the protests that took place in the end of September 2019 in the major city of the country. Moreover, representatives of a number of Egyptian social movements, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood and the National Salvation Front, accused President al-Sisi of political duplicity. While calling on other states to abandon weapons of mass destruction, Egypt nevertheless remains outside the framework of the Conventions on the Prohibition of Chemical and Biological Weapons. In addition, a group of revenge seekers, including high-ranking officers of Mukhabarat, are promoting the idea that Egypt has insufficient military potential to deal with external threats. According to representatives of this group, the presence of Egypt's serious strike technologies, which means, first of all, weapons of mass destruction, could become a serious determinant factor in the Egyptian-Turkish confrontation in the Middle East. Another difficulty, according to the experts, may be the problem of blurring the territorial framework of the Middle East. For example, according to the Israeli geopolitical concept, Egypt is territorially part of Africa, which already has a nuclear-free zone created in accordance with the Pelindaba Treaty. Within the framework of this approach, the efforts of the Egyptian leadership to create a nuclear-free zone and VMD-free zone in the Middle East look like an attempt to improve their political image. Next slide, please. As in the case of Israel, the official position of Saudi Arabia is largely determined by the presence of a permanent threat from the main regional rival, the Islamic Republic of Iran. The increased attention to the growing regional potential of Iran, as well as the collapse of JCPOA, inevitably led to the formation of a complex of preventive containment in the foreign policy agenda. So the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud, said that the appearance of nuclear weapons in Saudi Arabia could become a mirror measure for a similar step on the part of Iran. In addition, public opinion in Saudi Arabia is the same. Saudi society, in recent years, more and more susceptible to great power sentiments, puts at the head of national policy the acceptation of the status of a leading regional power. This desire was especially activated against the background of rivalry with Qatar in the first half of 2019. The growing likelihood of normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel finally consolidates the status of enemy number one for Iran, which, coupled with the prospect of lifting the arms embargo, only strengthens the confidence of the country leadership in the development of its own nuclear technologies. Even though Saudi Arabia positions its nuclear program as a peaceful, there are a number of alarming moments in it. In particular, according to US intelligence reports, Riyadh, with the mediation of a number of Chinese companies, is building a plant for the production of uranium concentrate, so-called yellow pie, near the city of Al-Ula, which is an integral component of nuclear warheads. In this context, the concept of VMD-free zone comes into direct conflict with the national and public interest on the Saudi Arabia. Next slide, please. Another country caught in the grip of nuclear renaissance mood is Turkey. So on September the 4th, 2019, Turkish President Recep Erdogan, speaking in the city of Sivas, said that Turkey has a full moral right to possess nuclear weapons. Given that since the late 1990s, the country has traditionally held a position of neutrality on the issue of creating a nuclear-free zone, such a statement was the first official confirmation of a change in the ideological vector in the highest echelons of power. However, unlike the Saudi Arabia, where the main goal of the nuclear program is to contain the growing power of Shiite Iran against the Sunni Arab states, the Turkish leadership positions is a key instrument of pressure on Israel. Erdogan's impulsive speech in Sivas in general reflects the revanchist sentiments in Turkish society. So, according to the Russian Institute for the Middle East Research, the rating of support for Turkish president after his speech in Sivas increased by 6 points. Experts also include to believe that against the background of the ghostly prospect of Turkey joining to the nuclear club, the likelihood of its support for the concept of VMD-free zone becomes even more ghostly. Next slide, please. So now we can summarize that the project of EMD-free zone in the Middle East is still in the idea stage. The lack of practical support from the UN initiative, aggravated by interstate disagreements and ambitious public perceptions of the EMD-free zone, prevents the states of the Middle East from reaching a mutually beneficial solution. In addition, weak lobbying from the idea is also caused by the unwillingness of other managing players, in particular NATO, to withdraw their nuclear arsenals from the territory of the Middle East states, thereby making fundamental changes in their own military doctrines. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Leonid, for your thoughtful presentation. Our next speaker, Oksana Lekarenko, Euratom's nuclear safeguard system as a challenge to the IAEA. Please, Oksana, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm very pleased to be here to participate in this conference. So my thanks to Ural Federal University and Ekaterina Mikhailenko for invitation to take part in this event. Thanks Arina for helping me with presentation. In my report, I will talk about early history of nuclear non-proliferation regime and how the Euratom nuclear safeguards challenge that regime. The next slide, please. Nuclear safeguards are an essential part of the international regime of nuclear non-proliferation. They contain a set of technical measures, including inspections, to verify that states adhere to their international obligations not to use nuclear programs for weapons purposes. The International Atomic Energy Agency is the primary institution that administers this international regime. The next slide, please. The foundation of the international nuclear safeguards regime was negotiated from the 1950s through the early 1970s. There are several main stages in that process. The first stage concerned bilateral agreements on cooperation, which the United States of America signed in 1955. Agreements include provisions that states receiving aid agreed to maintain security measures to ensure that special nuclear materials received from the United States Atomic Energy Commission are used solely for peaceful objectives and to store these materials safely. In addition, the agreements granted the Atomic Energy Commission the right to access all places and data necessary to verify that nuclear materials were not being diverted to military use. That means the introduction of direct American control and delegating the part of national sovereignty to another state. The second stage of nuclear safeguards regime was connected with the creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency in 1957, as well as other organizations such as the European Nuclear Energy Agency and Euratom. That organizations paved the way to the establishment of international safeguards regime. The nuclear safeguard provisions were included to the IAEA statute. Instead of direct American control, the international inspectors were envisaged. The international safeguard system was expected to be more effective because the states that had signed the IAEA statute were obliged to fulfill their international obligations and were more inclined to the international inspections than to the inspections of the representatives of another state. The second stage is connected with the ratification of Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that made safeguards mandatory for all non-nuclear weapon states that had signed the treaty. The nuclear weapon states pledged not to share nuclear weapons or related technology with the non-nuclear weapon states, whilst the latter promised not to seek these weapons. Thus, the NPT established the legal basis for the international safeguards regime. The next slide, please. In my research, I would like to answer the following questions. Why the Western European countries, members of the European Atomic Energy Community, established their own safeguard system in parallel with the creation of the IAEA? Why the United States, the main architect of the IAEA, authorized Euratom to implement its own safeguards? The next slide, please. To answer these questions, I worked with some documents. First of all, official text of the IAEA and Euratom, then the published American diplomatic documents, and also unpublished material such as declassified records from the United States National Archive in the state of Maryland. The next slide, please. In parallel with the creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the 6 Western European countries, such as France, the Federal Republic of Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, in 1957 created their own organization for peaceful nuclear cooperation known as Euratom. The organization was authorized to implement its own safeguards. It was a condition imposed by the founding fathers of Euratom. Europeans favored self-expansion among the Euratom member states over the IAEA safeguards. The problem of nuclear safeguards became the main obstacle for signing the agreement on cooperation between the United States and Euratom in 1958. While the United States Atomic Energy Commission and the first Director General of the IAEA, Sterling Cole, insisted on American or international inspections, the Western European countries perceived the international system of nuclear safeguards as a threat to national sovereignty. For the members of Euratom, self-inspection was a sign of the esteem in which the United States held the supranational institutions coming into being on the continent, and a marker which differentiated Europe from the rest of the non or not yet nuclear powers. The next, please. There was huge discussion in the United States during the period of signing the Treaty of Euratom, and also when the agreement on cooperation between the United States and Euratom was negotiated. And there were different positions during this discussion. First of all, the president of the US Atomic Energy Commission, Strauss, and the Director General of IAEA, Sterling Cole, insisted that self-inspection would undermine the core mission of the International Atomic Energy Agency and set an acceptable precedent for others, for the Soviet Union, for example, for the socialist countries, and also for developing countries. But on the contrary, the Department of State argued in favor of Euratom independence in the nuclear safeguards issue. American documents demonstrate very well that, for the sake of European integration, the United States administration supported the Euratom safeguard system. The next, please. The next slide. I don't know. Okay, my connection was interrupted. Is it okay now?
Yes, we can hear you well, and we will see the presentation.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, you can continue.
Yeah, did you hear my last point?
Yes,
maybe to repeat the previous slide, because I don't know when the connection was interrupted. Okay, the conclusions. For the sake of European integration, the United States administration supported the Euratom safeguard system. That was an independent system, the functioning of which the United States could review from time to time through consultations with Euratom. The privileges granted to Euratom undermined the role of the IAEA. Even after the signing of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which established the legal basis for the international safeguards regime, Euratom didn't relinquish its right to inspections to the IAEA. Instead of that, in 1973, 7 countries, members of Euratom, not possessing nuclear weapons, the Federal Republic of Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Ireland, and Denmark, entered into an agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency on the implementation of safeguards under the NPT, according to which the agency carried out its inspections by monitoring the inspection activities of Euratom. The Euratom self-inspection had been limited to the IAEA authority, making it even more difficult for the agency to fulfill its function as an independent guardian of nuclear non-proliferation. The safeguard issue became a major source of tension between Euratom and the IAEA for many years afterward. And the last slide, please. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, all speakers, for your well-prepared and absolutely interesting reports. I would like to start Q&A session. So we have many questions, but unfortunately, not fortunately, we have enough time to answer at least 3 or 4 questions for each speaker. Mr. Adlan Margoyev, can you please start to answer your questions?
Sure.
Thanks.
Got off the connection, so the chat box is empty now, but I had saved all the questions that I had received, so I will try to address all of them. So to Vasily Tuganov, who asked whether Antony Blinken will take a pro-Israeli side in the U.S. relationship and approach to the JCPOA and Iran in general, I would say the team is well balanced, the potential Biden team, and irrespective of personal preferences and backgrounds, I think the general approach of the US establishment to Iran will be pretty much solidified, because they do take into account the Israeli security concerns. They did so, and in that regard, I will reiterate my point that even the Trump administration and the potential Biden administration does not differ much from each other in terms of what they would love to see as an ideal Iran, but their approaches to how to get there differ. And the realistic approach of the Biden administration may, accommodate some of the diplomatic mechanisms that can be in place, while the Trump administration just outright rejected any diplomacy and wanted pure concessions on the Iranian side. So I think the Biden administration will combine diplomacy and but still will not abandon the demands that the Americans have in terms of Iranian behavior in the region, how they put it. To Alyona Shishkina on the EU role in the Iran deal, unfortunately, the European Union did not manage to do much to secure the deal in absence of the US participation, or against the US withdrawal of against the backdrop of the US withdrawal from the JCPOA. Now the Europeans may feel that they can do more because they are aligned with the current or the future US approach to the Iran deal, and they may be more successful. But as Iranians see the Europeans they have no power whatsoever to take steps and decisions that would run against the US policy vis-a-vis Iran. So EU can do things only when everything is okay, but not more than that. To Nikita Degtyaryov, did the US leave the deal because of the JCPOA violations or the regional policy of Iran? Of course, everyone in Iran, in the US understood, and even in the Israeli security establishment, they did value the JCPOA for what it, at least what it stated as its as its policy. So and the objectives of the JCPOA. Iran did follow the JCPOA, but the key reason for abandoning the deal was that it did not cover every problem that the US had with the Iranians. So they left the deal because of the greater set of demands. And to get the list, you can Google 12 points and 12 demands by Mike Pompeo to Iran, and you will get all the concerns that the Americans have with regard to Iran and its nuclear program and regional policies. To Ekaterina Poryadina on the compensation. I like this question because nobody has an answer. Even the Iranians don't have it. What I can hear from my Iranian colleagues is that the compensation may take a different shape. It's not only about, or not mainly about money, but it is about cooperation. It is about the projects in the nuclear field that one can pursue with Iran under the JCPOA. There was Annex 3 outlining areas of cooperation to the JCPOA, outlining areas of cooperation with the Iranians. And as much as the international community can do in the nuclear field with Iran, start new projects, make Iran feel that it is a normal country in the nuclear field and globally, and is trusted to be part of international projects where you can get new technology, where you can advance as a nation, and demonstrate to the Iranian people that Iran is benefiting from such cooperation. Then it may not be only about sending a check to Tehran, but some other creative approaches as well. And to Anna Baranova, on the US administration and Israel, I think I addressed this point when I answered Vasily's question. So, and to Bella Kuleshova and to Anna Baranova, I shared a couple of papers that would address your questions. I might return to this later if we have time and if it's necessary.
Thank you, Adlan. So I would like to continue with the Gleb option.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing the questions. All right, let me take a look at them. So even though we have plenty of time, I think I'll be able to address all of them. I'll try to be brief as possible. Okay, so the first question had to do with whether close cooperation between China and Pakistan will or will not lead to escalation of relations in South Asia. Historically, the cooperation between China and Pakistan was there during the Cold War, and we know how the situation was in the sub-region. So we had several wars, full-fledged wars between India and Pakistan, and of course, the cooperation between China and Pakistan in the not military, but peaceful nuclear sphere is still there. And you can see the Himalayan standoff between India and China, and the relation between both neighbors, I mean, China and Pakistan. So New Delhi's relations with these countries are definitely not good at all. Nevertheless, there is still some room for optimism to my mind, because even after the situation of summer 2020, the escalation didn't go as far as an open armed clash, I would say this. So the next question had to do with the nuclear weapons-free zone, right? Are there any prospects for expanding the Southeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone treaty and for including other Asian countries? Well, technically, I don't think this is how this treaty works, because you would have to make another provisional treaty or another document, because even if hypothetically we look at the neighbors of this nuclear weapons free zone, I don't see any potential state who could join it. You see, maybe theoretically Bhutan, but again, I'm not sure. So if we look, south, there is this Rarotonga Treaty Zone. So this is why I don't think this is feasible at all. The urgent problem with this treaty, as I see it, however, is the ratification of the protocols by the nuclear weapon states, namely US, France. They used to have their interests in the region, the colonial past, for example, US and Philippines on the one hand, France and some Southeast Asian countries such as Vietnam or maybe Cambodia to some extent. So the problem is this, I think, still this mentality that has to be changed, because in my opinion, there's nothing really scary about signing the protocols. Next question had to do with seismic activities. So when you spoke about nuclear power in the Asia Pacific, you mentioned the increased seismic activity in the region. Are there any technical possibilities today to influence this problem and regulate seismic activity? Well, I don't think, even as powerful as we are as mankind for now, I don't think this would be possible. Of course, with man-made events, with man-made activities, it's one thing. And we thankfully have the IMS system, International Monitoring System of the CTBTO, which works really well. And it detected the Fukushima event. It detected this nuclear test by North Korea. They have radionuclide, seismic, and many other systems, 4 systems in general. But I think our colleagues spoke about it much more in a much more expert way yesterday. So I think it's rather predict than influence, because it's nature, and any kind of interference would be, I think, detrimental to my mind. Okay, one more question. So about rivalry between India and Pakistan. Does the rivalry between India and Pakistan, which are both nuclear states and not parties of NPT to NPT, affect the regional nuclear energy supply, if I'm not mistaken? Because I see this question was copied from. Okay, nevertheless, so it does influence, of course, because as far as I know, I'm not an expert on fossil fuel projects, but I know that there were some projects to construct a pipeline from Iran, if I'm not wrong, with India and Pakistan, and this would be, quite ambitious on the one hand. Nevertheless, due to these political rivalries, it's really not possible. Of course, we don't take the nuclear sphere, because it's quite obvious that civilian and military nuclear fuel cycles are closely intertwined. This is why India was sour for this Chinese-Pakistan cooperation, taking into account that this was illegal in terms of international law, the AQ-CAN network, which is really well studied, and this is a case study that all experts in nuclear non-proliferation should be aware of course. So I think the situation in region, of course, is aggravated by this. In case I missed any questions, I do want to say sorry. Please repeat them again in the chat box, because I think I took all of them, pretty much all of them. And if there are any further questions, I will be happy to take them later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Teropchin, and thank you for pointing out that if some question didn't get an answer, please repeat in the chat. So next move to Leonid Sukhanov. Leonid, the everyone would like to hear your answers.
Thank you, Irina. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. So I'll start from the first question. Why there isn't any Iran-like pressure on Israel? So the situation with Israel is a complex of factors. First of all, excessive pressure on Israel from Western countries can disrupt the process of resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict in context of Abraham agreements, in which the Western countries are not interested. Secondly, Israel is cleverly using the antithesis mechanism, indicating that the Iranian nuclear problem is still not resolved. Therefore, there is no need to waste attention on the other states. As for the second question, is it possible to speak about the creation VMD-free zone in the near future, and especially while the regional actors are not involved in the conversations? So this is a really difficult question, but it really requires consideration. Despite the fact that there are many other security challenges in the region, we are witnessing an increase in the interest of the states of the Middle East themselves in the gradual implementation of the initiative. At least at the last conference, the initiative was particularly transferred to the regional players, and in my point of view, it's quite good sign, and maybe it will be the next steps. Of course, the prospects for creating a VMD-free zone in the near future are very little, but even such a small step, in my opinion, deserves attention and support. The next question: how can the current COVID-19 pandemic influence the creation of a VMD-free zone? Thank you for the question. The COVID pandemic, first of all, influenced the format of interaction. When all meetings are held online, backstage diplomacy, which played no less role in the negotiation process on VMD-free zone than real negotiations, was virtually nullified. It can be assumed that the pandemic delayed the implementation of the initiative by at least 5 or 10 years, especially because of these problems. So the next question: is Egypt not a member of biological and chemical conventions because it wants to have chemical and biological weapon capabilities, or because it's protest against Israel's non-alignment with the NPT? So about protest, it's partly true. Egypt has repeatedly proposed a roadmap within the framework of which it was ready to voluntarily abandon any VMD it had. However, only on condition that Israel begins to take reciprocal steps towards disarmament, starting at least with joining the NPT. It can be assumed that even in the context of the agreements of Abraham, so-called Israel agreements, the situation will not change in near future. And the question: how do relations between Russia and the United States affect Turkey's opinion on the formation of VMD-free zone? So the relationship between the United States and Russia, of course, affects the Turkish position, but not as much as the existing clinch with Egypt. Recently, the rivalry between Ankara and Cairo has grown into open hostility, and the sides are ready to use any means to weaken the opponent influence. So VMD-free zone in this case is just one example.
Thank you, Leonid. So, Professor Likarenko, please share your thoughts on the questions.
Thank you, Pavel and Bella, for your questions. The first question is, what is the role of Euratom in international safeguards? I would like to say that the Euratom own safeguards is the byproduct of the Cold War. During Cold War, the United States allowed its the most closest allies to have its own safeguard system. And during International Atomic Agency and Euratom was signed several agreements during the Cold War in the 70s, in the 80s, and at the beginning of 90s about cooperation. And even after the end of the Cold War, the situation is the same, that European countries have its own system of safeguards, and International Atomic Energy Agency only can review the functioning of this system and these inspections. So it's some kind of gentleman agreement that European countries participate in this nuclear non-proliferation regime and fulfill their obligations. And the second question is the continuation of the first questions. What steps could be done to transform Euratom in order to strengthen the IAEA? One answer, which not the single answer which could be, is Euratom should relinquish its right to inspection to the International Atomic Energy Agency. But it is a matter of status, it is a matter of drought. So if the Europe wants to be a central power in this world, it's hardly to expect that European countries will relinquish this right. So I think there is no answer how they could do that by a legal way. But only just to continue this gentleman agreement. So it's civilized countries who will respect non-proliferation regime only in this way. That's all.
Thank you, Professor Lekarenko. Fortunately for us, we have some more time to discuss more questions. I think Adlan wants to add something at the end, right?
Yes, I can address publicly the two questions that I hopefully managed to answer in written. So the question by Bella Kuleshova was whether the JCPOA provides the IAEA with access to any facility in Iran. In fact, it's not just the JCPOA, it's the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement that Iran concluded with the IAEA and the additional protocol which Iran has concluded and signed but has never ratified in its parliament. And the JCPOA obliges Iran to provisionally implement the AP to the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, and actually goes beyond the limitations and the measures that the AP and Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement provide for. In that regard, that is mainly inspections and monitoring to the uranium mills and to greater array of facilities in Iran. And in fact, if we lose the JCPOA, then we may lose not only the measures that exceed the AP, but AP itself as well. And the Iranians may reconsider, as they put it, the nuclear doctrine that they have, and the bare minimum that we may have if we lose the JCPOA might be just the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, which does not provide for a timely and quick access to the facilities. And to Anna Baranova, who asked whether we could think of a new deal with Iran. In that regard, we have to define who we are. If we, as Moscow and Russia, we are satisfied with the JCPOA. The intention of Moscow to take part in the negotiations and implementation of the deal was not to renew the agreements every 10 to 20 years and say JCPOA 2.0, JCPOA 3.0, and extend those provisions. Moscow, as actually Tehran, negotiated the deal to see the day and to make it sooner, the day when the Iranians would be considered as they put it, a normal nation. It's not even my term, it's how the Iranians say they want to be a normal nation.
which would be treated as any other nation in terms of the safeguards monitoring and generally as a country internationally. So Moscow wanted to get this day closer to the reality and to us. We do not need a new deal with the Iranians. As for the Americans, they do want a new deal, and even the Democrats who safeguarded the JCPOA and criticized Trump for leaving the agreement, even they are not satisfied with the agreement that they could get in 2015, because it does not cover all the issues that the Americans have with the Iranians. And B, the deadlines are approaching fast. And in 2023, the Iranians will be allowed to import and export ballistic missile technology, something that neither Democrats nor Republicans can allow the Iranians to do and can allow to happen. So, of course, they want to extend the deadline, as we usually like doing, and seek a new agreement which will be stronger in terms of the measures that they take. And in fact, can the JCPOA be even stricter in terms of the nuclear provisions? Not so much. And the original negotiators of the JCPOA understand that this deal does provide quite a robust access to and verification measures to the Iranian nuclear program. But again, whenever certain issues appear in the communication between the Iranians and the IAEA, and specifically I'm referring to the two facilities that the IAEA sought access to and did not get it immediately, and there were some bureaucratic hurdles, but then Rafael Grossi, the new DG, visited Tehran, and they resolved at least one of the two issues that they had. And still the clarifications on the traces of anthropogenic uranium that were found in one of the Iranian facilities are not robust enough for the IAEA to make necessary conclusions. So the Americans want a new deal to enhance this ability of the IAEA to access those facilities, to make it even timelier, to shorten the time period for requesting the access and getting it, and potentially punishing Iran for not being quick enough to provide this access. But mainly the follow-on deal would be about extending what we already have for, let's say, 10 more years. And then for covering other activities that Iran is pursuing in the region. And I shared two papers that outline certain issues to be covered by this deal, or at least, or in parallel to a renegotiated deal. As for the Iranians, of course, they don't want any deals, but they may have to under the pressure that they are suffering from the pressure by the US. And here, the Biden administration is going to capitalize on the leverage that they received thanks to the Trump administration. So had the Trump administration not left the JCPOA, today, 4 years since the Trump administration inauguration, the US would have a weaker leverage on Iran's foreign policy and nuclear program. And now, this is a paradox. They criticize Trump for what he has been doing to Iran in the JCPOA, but at the same time are going to benefit, even publicly and openly, from what he has done, and because it has put the Iranians in a much weaker position that they could have been had the US not left the agreement. So the Iranians don't want a new deal, but they may have to go for it. As long as it, as long as it brings more bounties to Tehran and provides for some new opportunities, like again enhancing economy, buying airplanes by Boeing and Airbus, and buying weapons, importing new tech, being part of the economic activities and production lines globally, and supply chains, etc. and not, of course, not having sanctions hurting the economy. As for Russia, Russia will not abstain from potential negotiations with Iran if Iran is willing to negotiate. And if Russia's economic and especially security interests are met, and Russia's participation is useful to both Moscow and the parties involved, then we won't say like, you know, deal with it on your own. We are not going to play your games. I think we will join it and see whether it has any merit. So I hope I did not waste much of your time answering these two questions.
Thank you, Mr. Margoyev, for your addition. I think there is some question for the option. Could you please answer?
Yes, that's right. Thank you. That was this question I missed accidentally. I swear I didn't do that on purpose, so no offense. It was a question about the thorium cycle. So let me read it out loud. Thorium cycle reactors are definitely a future technology due to their higher safety and low military use potential. What obstacles their development and introduction are facing? So I think you should ask this question someone with a PhD in nuclear engineering, but I will try to answer this question to the best of my knowledge. As far as I understand it, there are several obstacles. Some of them are of social constructivist nature. I would say some of them are purely technical. So speaking about social issue, I think the world and the nuclear community in itself is already happy with the uranium and plutonium cycles as I see it, and developing a whole new technology is a risk of a kind, if you know what I mean. And the technical issues have to do with using thorium as fuel, because as I understand it, uranium is much more feasible for these purposes to be used as fuel. With thorium, you would need to, if I'm not wrong, bombard it with neutrons or something. Maybe someone with technical background might correct me. There are some more problems because the issue is related with its higher radioactivity in long term. Again, which is also a problem. And then again, you would need to create a whole new regime in terms of legal boundaries, how to control it. Will it be within the IAEA? Will it be somewhere else? Or will we need a Zanger committee or a nuclear suppliers group to include these new maybe isotopes, maybe something else into their documents? So yeah, it might be a problem. Nevertheless, I would like to round up and say this is theoretically an inexhaustible source of energy, and as far as I know, there have been some research and development projects related to it with the thorium, with the fast breeder reactors. But again, only time will show, I think. So.
Thank you. So as far as I can see, we have some dialogue in chat. If another could repeat, yes. So you have some more time to answer the question.
Sorry, my connection is poor once again. But I got that. I got the floor. So would the new US administration consider concerns of Israel in possible negotiations on the JCPOA? I actually quickly passed on this question when I replied to the question by Vasily Tuganov, I think. Yes, the new administration will be online with Israel. It may not be as, buying whatever the Israelis say as the Trump administration did. And the US administration, the new US administration may dissect the US interests from the Israeli interests and see have a distinction see the distinction between them. But if you study the Israeli security establishment and their views on the JCPOA, they in fact valued the JCPOA, and they never opposed it for what it standard for. And the JCPOA standard for enhanced IAEA inspections regime and monitoring of the Iranian nuclear program. And who would oppose anything, any of that in Tel Aviv or in Israel? Nobody would do that. So they did support it, but they wanted more. And how to get more from Iran? That is the question. And if the Israeli are more on the aggressive kind of a hawkish side of things, the Trump administration followed the suit and would take the lead on that, the Biden administration may want to go through diplomacy. Of course, not just diplomacy, but diplomacy and pressure. But at least that will be the distinction between the outgoing and the incoming administrations. And what the Israeli, I don't think that Israel and US in terms of their lookout in the region and their perceptions differ much and would have a different list of demands to Tehran. The lists are pretty much similar. It's just the approach that the two parties involved may take. And I think the Biden administration will not be softer on Iran, but diplomacy does not mean that you are, stopped to be hard and tough. You just negotiate and, carrots and sticks together. It will be a mix, a new mix, giving what we have observed in the Trump administration and what we are going to see probably starting from next year.
I'm sorry. I have some technical problems and I want to try to went from the different account. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers, for well-detailed answers. I would like to give an opportunity for our speakers, Professor Lekarenko and Leonid Sukhanov, to make some final comments if they want. So, as I understood, you didn't want it. Thank you. So this is the end of the Q&A session. Thank you for your questions and thank you for your answers. Kamran?
Thank you, Arina. Dear colleagues, dear guests.
Kamran, we did not hear you.
Really?
I do.
Do you hear me now?
No.
Yes? Yes?
Yes, we can hear you.
Arina, please check your connection.
I also hear, it seems that only Arina doesn't hear.
Only Arina cannot hear me. So, dear colleagues, dear guests, sorry for technical problems and the inconveniences it may have caused. I think that these are shortcomings of the online format, but still I hope that you enjoyed our session. So we are moving forward to the, first of all, thank you very much for your interesting and topical reports and thought-provoking questions. So we are moving forward to the student sessions. At 3 p.m. Moscow time, we will have 3 parallel sessions. First one is Nuclear Non-Proliferation Regime, Old and New Challenges. Moderator is Professor Ekaterina Mikolenko. Second, Nuclear Issues on the US-Russian Agenda. Moderator is Professor Dmitry Pobedash. And the third one, under my moderation, is Regional Challenges to the Regime. So if you want to participate in a certain session, please feel free to write it in our chat, and we will distribute all the participants between these three sessions. Thank you very much. So see you at 3 p.m. Moscow time.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.